We are obviously very honored to have Gabe Newell, founder of Valve Corporation, here with us today. I know that for most of you, Gabe Newell does not need any introduction. Valve is an immensely successful gaming company, and Steam has evolved into a major electronic market with 55 million customers around the globe. Today, Mr. Newell will discuss his views on productivity, economics, political institutions, and the future of corporations. Mr. Newell.
So I'm Gabe, and so Valve was founded in 1996. We're a privately held company, and that's actually a consequence of other decisions that we made that I'll touch on later. We made single-player games like Half-Life, multiplayer games like Team Fortress. We built an internet services platform called Steam that, as Sherry said, has 55 million users and 2,500 different applications running on it. So the question would be, other than my charming personality, is Valve interesting, right? Like, why is Valve an interesting company? So if you use super gross metrics, it sounds like it could be interesting. We grow about 50% a year and have since we started the company. And we tend to make people very productive, and they add a lot of value. So if you look at Apple or Google or Microsoft, we have much higher revenue and profitability per employee than they do. And, we generate more internet traffic than most countries, right? I think we're the fourth largest bandwidth consumer in the world right now. So that says something is happening here, but is it interesting beyond just being another company that makes a bunch of money? Well, my path, which I'm going to use to sort of illustrate, I'm going to sort of walk you through how I learned and what I learned that applies to Valve, and hopefully use that to motivate your own understanding of the choices that we've made and what, if any, significance they have. So I was at Microsoft from 1983 to 1996. I started off working on the Macintosh applications and then switched over to operating systems. Now, one of the things was that in 1983, there was a company called Businessland. Businessland is a sort of an answer to a trivia question nowadays. At the time, they were sort of the biggest seller of PCs to small businesses in the world. And they would take 50% of the gross revenue of a sale. So somebody like Osborne would sell them a machine for $1,000, and they'd mark it up to $2,000. If you flash forward to 2012, oftentimes our games are sold at negative margins at retail. So we'll sell in a product into retail, and they'll actually sell it to consumers for even less. So they're hoping that maybe they'll generate some foot traffic that will help offset the negative margins they're taking on us by selling something that is likely to attract people's attention, and then maybe you'll buy, some blank CDs or something. So what's happened? Why is this part of the value chain lost so much control over the whole process? And is that generalizable? Is it just a unique instance, or is it something that's symptomatic of a broader set of trends? Well, in the early 90s, my own experience in answering that question started sort of in the early 1990s. So Microsoft had no idea what was happening in the real world with our products. We'd have reseller lists. So you'd sell your product to somebody else who would then take a pallet that we would physically put together. They'd break it down, and then they'd sell the individual products out to lots of little stores. And those resellers represented only one small fraction of the total product being sold. They had nothing to do with anything other than the North American market. And so, but we would post these reseller lists where they would tell us what products were selling out of their warehouses. And that was pretty much the complete insight we had into how our products were performing in the real world. So product managers would obsess over relative motions of one or two spots on a top 10 list. But the idea that you would know what was happening through an OEM channel or happening with corporate accounts or happening anywhere outside of the United States was more or less science fiction. This was, a well-run company in the early 1990s. So at one point, the applications group had to make a bunch of decisions like, hey, these crazy Windows guys, they're saying that Windows is doing super well, but Lotus is telling all their corporate accounts that Windows is the sales numbers are all fake, and that people are not adopting Windows in any significant way. This was going to materially impact how quickly they tried to move all of their products over to Windows rather than continuing to be character-based. So Microsoft commissioned this really large study where rather than looking at the sales side of it or the reseller side of it, they'd actually go out into the real world and see what people were actually doing. It was like the first time Microsoft had done it, is to look at 10,000 people's machines to figure out what they were actually using PCs for. Well, it turns out they're using them for porn and video games, and that part of the study was immediately ignored. But the good news was that if you extrapolated those numbers, was that Windows was actually being used on 30 million people's PCs in the United States. And this was cause for enormous celebration. Thank God they're actually using it rather than just getting it shoved onto their Dell or Compaq machine and immediately uninstalling it and going back to character mode DOS. But the thing that was really striking to me at the time was that Windows was the number 2 product. And probably most of you know what the number 1 product was. Anybody? It was Doom. So Doom was one of the first-person action games shipped by a company called id that's located in Mesquite. So somehow, the largest software company in the world was being out-distributed by a 12-person company in Mesquite, Texas. And there was no conception, there's no model for why this made any sense. How could they possibly have done that, right? I mean, it took years to build up enough distribution strength to go from number 7 to number 6 in the word processing category, much less come out of nowhere with a product that would be on more desktops than the most important product that Microsoft had. And at the same time that Doom was out there with a completely different approach to connecting users with value, people with inside of Microsoft were arguing, we need a 500-person, Rob Glazer, who eventually started Real Networks, was saying, we can't be competitive with Novell NetWare until we hire a 500-person sales force. And all they're going to do is sell LAN Manager to the resellers. So they weren't even going to sell to customers. They were investing in an indirect channel and making this giant, building this giant organization that continues to live on within Microsoft all these years later, who were not actually directly involved in making that sale. So that was sort of the landscape at this point in time. And there were 2 other interesting data points. There's another company that was called Ventura, who made Ventura Publisher. Have any of you ever heard of that? It was the same kind of thing as Doom. And they were the first people that I ever met with who explicitly said, retail distribution and marketing is a commodity, and we're not even going to bother investing in it. Instead, we're going to build a great product. And once we have a great product, we'll turn around and then we'll put it out to bid. Who wants to give us the highest percentage? They ended up going with Xerox, and Xerox eventually proved that sales and marketing aren't quite as commodified as the Ventura guys had thought they were, so they probably underperformed what they could. But they're the first people to say, let's just ignore all of this other stuff. It'll actually make us worse. We'll just focus on the thing that we do super well, and this other thing is going to become declining in value constantly. At the flip side of it was the IBM PC Junior. And the interesting thing about the PC Junior at the time, is I guess 1987, was that the burdened cost of shipping an empty box by IBM was over the retail price of the PC Junior. In other words, they couldn't possibly be profitable ever selling products in that category. Their choices about the organization, their investment in direct corporate sales, the way that they had structured themselves financially made it impossible for them to even move an empty, a nothing through their inventory process and into a customer's hands. So both of these things make you start to think about what's going on. I'll sort of do a shortcut to the conclusion, which was there were structural changes that were affecting the relative value of line of business functions, and that whole categories within typical corporations were essentially being made obsolete. That communications to your customers were on an exponentially decreasing cost curve, and everything that was associated with talking to a customer or delivering a product to a customer. And this would be true whether you're doing virtual, digital products or physical products. It would just be more obvious when you also had low cost for incremental production, right? All the costs associated with building a video game tend to be associated before you sell your first copy. Selling the copy plus one is relatively cheap. So even though this thing would be true, just as true for John Deere tractors as it was for video games, it would probably be more testable and provable in spaces where you could easily see that the low friction delivery of a good didn't involve significant incremental costs. So what did that mean in terms of how you were designing a company? This is the question I was trying to answer in 1996. Because we'd go out and we'd meet with all these companies. You'd meet with insurance companies and airline companies and startups in Silicon Valley. And you had to come up with some way of thinking about what the design was. And the thing that we became convinced of, Mike Harrington, who's the other founder, and myself, was that everybody was going in the wrong direction. There's sort of a movement towards outsourcing. And outsourcing is essentially, where can we find the lowest cost English language speakers somewhere in the world, and we'll give them a job and they'll do it just as well for a lot less money. To us, that seemed exactly the opposite of what you should be doing, and what we decided was that we were going to buy the most expensive talent that was out there in the world. That the opportunity was that those were the people who were least correctly valued. By talent, which is a word I hate, I just mean the ability to be productive. Now, one of the things that sort of helps people in the software space think about this is that it's relatively easy to look at relative productivity of people within that space. So at IBM in the 1980s, typical productivity would be 1,000 debugged shipped lines of code per year, right? That was the metric that they used for sort of their median employee. Whereas when we were shipping Half-Life 1, one employee, Jan Bernier, was shipping 4,000 lines of code per day. So there's pretty clearly, it's easy to see that there's, even if you're not arguing about whose lines of code are more useful, and arguably Jan's lines of code were way more useful than somebody developing a 3270 terminal emulator for OS2, even if you're just looking at the raw production, it's easy to see that there's huge variation in productivity. One of the sort of tenets that we used was that was probably true across a much wider range of functions, right? So we started from the assumption that even though it's easy to see that there's huge variation in productivity in software programmers, there was probably that same variation in a lot of other roles. So when we designed Valve, we said, okay, that's what we're trying to do. Everything goes back to this fundamental question of how do you attract and retain the most highly productive people in the world? Because if our thesis is correct, that's where we're going to create our greatest incremental value, right? We could hire a whole bunch of. There was a big thing a couple of years ago where everybody was trying to hire low-cost content producers in India and China. And we were trying to do the opposite. We were saying, if somebody somewhere, somebody working on a feature film production in New Zealand is making $200,000 a year, if they come to Valve, they should be making $500,000 or $5 million, creating that much value. We'll split the difference and go from there. So there are consequences of those choices. Nobody's asking questions, which has me a little bit worried. There are consequences. One, Valve is not a publicly traded company. Being a publicly traded company adds a bunch of headaches, and it didn't really solve any problems for us, right? It meant that control around decision making now involved third parties. So for a developer or somebody building something at Valve, it's like there's the customer and they're the person that you're trying to make happy. And from the time that you make a change in a product, it's 15 minutes, worst case, before a customer is actually using that. There's no approval process. If you make a bad decision, it's 15 minutes until you've fixed that problem. You don't go to board meetings where the board argues about what the series, this third series of venture capitalists are worried about, dilution and hitting certain targets, right? There's no notion of a distribution channel who says we're really looking for something that fits in this particular slot at this particular time. The whole point of being a privately held company is to eliminate another source of noise in the signal between the consumers and producers of a good. One of the other things is that the kinds of people that we thought fit this model don't need titles, right? That titles are actually the enemy of their enemy rather than being something that makes them more productive. Oftentimes their solutions in one generation are different than their solutions in the previous generation. And that an explicit organization captured in titles makes it less likely for them to have the insights and to build the next generation of whatever it is that's going to be exciting, right? Whether it's the great example from Half-Life 1 is that the guy who designed the skeletal animation system also had a Bachelor of Fine Arts and could also build environmental art. So if you go to a movie nowadays, the idea that you would have a single person doing even much more than a subset of any of those roles is mind-boggling. But there are a set of experiences that you get in Half-Life 1 that are entirely a consequence of the person working on it being able to change the environment, change the code, or change the animations depending upon what was the most tractable way of solving the problem. So titles and organizations keep people from sort of properly encapsulating a problem at a point which allows them to be most productive. Does that make sense? Yes.
Yeah, as far as I know, Valve is like the only organization that has a pretty flat organizational structure that I've heard of. Was that something that you had at the outset of your creation of Valve?
Yes.
To have, or was that something like you decided that along the line that was how it should be after having gone to a traditional organization structure?
No, we always, this was part of the design of the company from the beginning. One of the other things along those same lines is the thing that people sort of, to us, we've been working this way for a long time, so it doesn't seem nearly as peculiar as it does to people on the outside. So another example that people tend to be a little bit surprised by is that management is a skill. It's not a career path. It's everybody is it's sort of, we assume that everybody's a mix of individual and group contribution, and there are a set of tasks that look like, that evolve over time related to project organization and just sort of keeping things going. And usually people refuse to do it twice in a row on back-to-back projects because it very much is, a service job. It's like, my job is to entirely define myself in terms of the productivity that I enable in other people. The next project, I just want to not, that's a very stressful job, and it's hard to measure your own productivity. Like everybody else says, hey, Jay, you did a great job. You should do it again. And Jay's like, screw you guys. So usually we look for some younger sucker to give the job to, who think that, who have some old notions about management and, its authority within a hierarchy related to decision making, and then they find out that it's, working really, really hard to make other people be more productive. So if that doesn't blow your mind, we have no QA department, right? We have no marketing department. We have one guy who calls himself a vice president of marketing because it confuses people if he doesn't tell them that when he's talking to them. But everybody at the company is we assume that their job is to talk to customers. Yep.
Like outside of the company, how are you able to hire and retain the sort of talent you're looking for?
So a lot of times it was just personally pitching people, saying, this is why we think this is an interesting opportunity. Some of the people that we thought were going to join us at the beginning didn't. We were like, let's go, let's storm the castle. And then there's like, where'd everybody go? Once you convinced people that you were doing something interesting, then they would start to rope in their friends. So a lot of it ends up being social networking at the end of the day. John Carmack was pretty helpful at getting this going. Michael Abrash was another guy. But we were also willing to take what other companies would say were risks. So one of the first programmers at the company, his previous job was manager of a Waffle House. And he was one of the most creative, and still is, one of the most creative programmers in the industry. In the back of the room?
Has your lab company structure changed since the days of Half-Life 1? Because with the increasing cost of software development, one person can do, I guess, less now than they did before. Has that changed the way your company works at all?
Well, our company evolves all the time. So I'll try to give you an example of how we evolve. I am a big believer in one person, one office. DeMarco's Peopleware, if anybody's read that, I sort of treat that as a Bible. And so I was like, I hated cubicles, like with a passion and a vengeance. It's like, they grew out of this data general philosophy of if you're screwing your employees, you're probably doing something right. And so I was like, okay, everybody always has their own office. And, and you've got a do not disturb button on your phone, and you have a door you can close, and you can decorate your office however you want. And people kept sneaking into other people's offices, and then they started tearing doors down. So everybody had their own office, but nobody was ever in it, right? So they were all congregating in our conference rooms, and so we had all these empty offices and all these clusters of people in conference rooms. And that's when I realized, they were making the right decision, right? They were deciding that there were benefits to being in closer proximity to other people, and that Gabe's rigid adherence to one person, one office was actually hurting their productivity. So even, after being hit on the head long enough, I realized that everybody else was making a decision that was correct for them. And so now we just say everybody designs their own office space. So our largest single room right now has about 80 people in it. I share an office with 2 other people. But each person, has to, that's one of the things that you think about. You think about how you communicate with other people. You think about what's an optimal work environment for the goals that you have. Desks are all on wheels. We only have 2 contact points with the floor, so you can pack up and join a different group of people in about 15 minutes. Some people are working on the design of, if anybody's done paired programming, there's some people who are trying to build a desk that's more optimal for paired programming and giving you a shared thing. And they have to make the decision whether it's more worth their time to work on something like that than it is to do the work that they already are. So we just sort of said, okay, each person has to make their own decisions about what they work on, who they're working with, what are the tools they need, and what their offices ought to look like. But that's how we evolve, usually by people deciding that I have a bad idea. Another thing that became very important sort of later on, but it is pretty much part of the design of Valve now, is if you're not making quantitative predictions, you're probably doing it wrong, or you're probably not doing it as well as you can. And that's sort of become kind of critical to how we operate. You have to predict in advance. Everybody can explain anything after the fact, and it has to be quantitative, or you're not being serious about how you're approaching the problem. Yes, in the green shirt?
So I'm at a flat company that actually experimented with development. What are some gaps or problems that you've encountered with the kind of flat hierarchy? Some lessons that have been learned that maybe help us?
You have to be really aggressive about firing people. We haven't done a really good job with interns or new hires. It's kind of a sink or swim thing. People have to take it seriously, right? It's an engineering problem, right? In the sense of you have to make decisions, you have to measure outcomes, you have to make changes as a result of it. So, like I would have trouble working any other way now, and I think most of the people at Valve would have trouble. There's something we call we sort of somewhat unkindly call the beaten wife syndrome, where people come in from other industries and really struggle. The worst are people from the feature film industry, where they've been sort of taught that anytime they show initiative, that somebody's going to leap out and smite them for doing that. And so that usually takes about 6 to 9 months for people to really sort of internalize the working model of the company. So those are some of the things we've encountered. Yep.
Do you think that might be the reason more companies don't follow your flat business model? It's sort of a personal responsibility type of thing?
I'm going to come back to how I think things are changing and why they're going to change in a little bit, and maybe if we come back to that question, you may have a different way of asking it. So to get onto that subject, these issues are going to collide in a couple of slides. So I'll start off with something. So how do we make a single-player game, right? A single-player game was the challenge that we first had when we were building Half-Life, which was, how do we make any decisions? People would say we should make games more realistic, and we sort of went down that rabbit hole. It turns out it's a horrible, horrible design trope to use. And so we had to come up with this notion that games are things which respond to agency on the part of the player. If the player performs an action or has a state, you need to recognize that and respond to it. That's a fairly abstract way of saying, if I shoot at a wall, something should happen. So when we started with Half-Life, your gun would fire, but the wall wouldn't change. The wall was essentially ignoring you. So then we'd put a decal in, and testers would go and spend an hour just drawing things on the wall with their machine guns. And we said, okay, so this looks like a useful heuristic for making game design decisions. In Half-Life 2, a piece of technology that was really hard, but turned out to, in our mind, to be super valuable, was modeling how people's eyes actually work when they're looking at you. So eyes are not spheres. So when your eye is rotating, you're going to see something that's like the highlights, the glints on your eye are going to move differently than if you model them as spheres. And people, turns out you have part of your brain that's hardwired to know where somebody's looking, right? Even though somebody's in the second row, they can tell that I'm looking at somebody in the third row. And so spending a bunch of time to make them aware of the characters aware of where you were in space, and that they're looking right correctly at that person, it turns out that people suddenly say, oh, these characters are nicer. These characters are more like me. These characters are smarter, right? So something as seemingly irrelevant to a game as making eyes work right turns out to generate the sense that this game is more fun. And that's how a heuristic leads you to interesting conclusions that you go and do. Now, of course, all this breaks down when you're trying to build a multiplayer game, right? A single-player game is sort of like a feature film where your lead actor is, kind of retarded and autistic, but you can sort of think of it as a feature film. In a multiplayer game, these rules that you've come up with sort of don't work anymore. So an example would be in Counter-Strike. We put the riot shield in and our player numbers go up. We take the riot shield out and our player numbers go up. So how do you explain that, right? You need a different way of thinking about what you're doing. You start to think after a while that multiplayer games are all about externalities that kind of look more like operating systems, so or a sport, right? So in terms of how they behave a lot more, and value is created a lot more like a spectator sport than a feature film. So that's pretty cool. The problem was, jump forward a couple more years, that this great model that we had for thinking about single-player games or multiplayer games seemed to be breaking down again. So there are a couple of interesting examples of that. One is free-to-play games. So on the surface, free-to-play games sound like a horrible idea. I will give my product away for free. Most people just sort of stop right there and go, okay, that's horrible. But in a free-to-play game, what you're really doing is you're creating a lot of goods that are related to status and affinity and hierarchy, right? You're creating a whole bunch of goods there, and the marginal or the incremental value of an audience member is greater than the incremental cost of making that person an audience member. So typically what we see with the free-to-play game, which on the surface sounds like suicide, is that your audience size goes up by a factor of 10 and your gross revenue goes up by a factor of 3. So since the incremental cost of another audience member is fairly small, just the cost of distributing those bits to those customers, your profitability tends to increase a lot more than a factor of 3. Now, okay, that's sort of puzzling. And then we start to see this thing occurring in lots and lots of games, where you have markets or auction houses. So you have trade in goods between different customers. And there's this sort of appalling thing that happens where somebody will play your game 20 hours a week for 4 years, and then the value of that all goes to zero, right? So it's like you bought a house and you made a bunch of improvements on the house, and when you move to your new house, you have to start over. You get no value from the investment that you've made. Clearly, these markets and auction houses are valuable, but or the assets that you've accrued were valuable to you enough to justify this tremendous expenditure of your time. But games seem to have this really sort of whimsical notion of your property rights. We're also seeing this huge uptick in user-generated content. So to be really concrete, 10 times as much content comes from the user base for TF2 as comes from us. So we think that we're super productive and kind of badass at making TF2 content, but even at this early stage, we cannot compete with our own customers in the production of content for this environment. So the only company we've ever met that kind of kicks our ass is our customers, right? We'll go up against Bungie or Blizzard or anybody, but we won't try to compete with our own user base because we already know that we're going to lose. Once we start building the interfaces for users to start selling their content to each other, we start to see some surprising things. So right now, I think the most anybody has earned in a single year is about $500,000. So they're making content, selling it to other customers, and we have a revenue share with those people, and their takeaway is $500,000. The first 2 weeks that we did this, we actually broke PayPal because they didn't have, I don't know what they're worried about, maybe drug dealing. They're like, nothing generates cash to our user base other than selling drugs like this. So we actually had to work something out with them and said, no, they're making hats, not. But now that we had this notion of, and another thing that was weird is we knew that people at other companies, other game companies, had employees who were making more money being users in our framework than they were being employees at their company. So we're like, okay, this is weird. And then it got more complex because we started to see things like inflation. We started to see deflation. We started to see users creating their own versions of currencies, mediums of exchange. Countries started to create regulatory structures. So in Korea, you actually have to create the equivalent of a W-4 form for your players to account for the virtual income they get in playing your game. And so you're like, okay, wait, should we increase the drop rate for those customers to offset the tax, the sort of sales or income tax that they're having? And what do we do about purchase price parity, right? Should we adjust drop rates to like provide welfare to people who are playing in low income, or do we drop the value of their drops to reflect the fact that they can trade their hats for cheeseburgers for fewer? I mean, how do we decide how we are creating productivity in this environment? We started to see trade. The trade is exploding, even though currently it's a barter economy. We started to have problems in liquidity, where at different times of day, certain mediums of exchange sort of dried up, and all of a sudden you had sort of weird little mini financial crises erupting in your TF2 hat exchange community. So when we started to see these kinds of issues, we said, oh, we should probably start talking to an economist. Yes?
Where'd like the value of like hats come in? Because like, I mean, it literally is like hats are like small staff booths and things like that. Like, what makes somebody spend $5 versus $32 for a cosmetic change in like a video game character?
I don't think the value for that is any different than the value of lots of other kinds of status goods, or why do people buy Porsches? So I don't think that there's anything super different about how value gets created. I mean, money. I mean, if you look at, people say, but these things aren't real. And then you go, well, what about money? And they go, that's not fair, So it speaks to, so one of the things that you can hear me say is that we're trying to optimize productivity. And that requires you to start thinking in terms of productivity in terms of what? And so it is an issue that we're struggling with right now. How do you think about what is the value, and how do you feel like you're not creating, like asset bubbles are something that worry us. And this is where, hopefully an economist, we're also, particularly I'm worried that there are a set of initial conditions that have different outcomes, and that by putting in the right kinds of structures and disciplines early on, we can avoid a lot of turbulence subsequently. Yes?
What about crafted items? I'm thinking EVE Online. It all starts with 4. You want to build a fight, you've got to go out and buy more.
Yep. So what we think is that you need some sort of market, and that what our job is to maximize the productivity of users in creating digital goods and services. That markets will determine what the marginal value add of each of those activities are, but the kinds of ways in which people create value are creativity and creating frameworks for that are going to vary. Now, you can't just define productivity in terms of shit you give to a customer, right? Then you've sort of missed the whole opportunity for, if you're just raining hats onto your customers, eventually you're probably going to suffer huge inflation and so on. So the way to think of it is that there's probably going to exist a central, I'll just use the term economy, and that games are all sort of instance dungeons hanging off of that. And within a game, I'll be able to create goods and services which I exchange with other people in other games. Some of the things that I will do is, hey, I got this hat, right? And then somebody else will say, I actually designed that hat, And the designer and creator of the hat is probably going to be a higher value person than the person who simply traded or acquired this asset in some other form. So you can have a bunch of different ways that people are going to be creating things. One group of people will simply be arbitrage, looking for trading opportunities and creating liquid markets in hats, right? But other people are saying, oh, I'm going to build a game, and my game contains animations and models, and environments. And the steps that we're taking right now are to plumb this notion of both ownership and authorship throughout the entire system. So I'll be able to create something in one game and exchange it for value with somebody else.